101FM. This is Eddie and Leah and Byron and our special guest Ras Judah. How's everyone going?
Good.
Good, thank you.
Yeah.
Right, it's probably the nicest Saturday it's probably
For
had
ages.
in a
Oh
while.
man, yeah.
Like, I have to actually admit, I'm going to confess to Byron. I'm going to make a confession. The rain's been keeping me away from the gym. And that's all I have to say.
Hey, I don't blame you at all.
So I'm saying the rain finally got me back into the gym. Like,
Really?
Yeah, because I like swimming, so but I don't want to walk back from the pool
Right.
when it's like 6 degrees.
I know. And it was getting cold during the nights. So, do you want to introduce our
Yeah, so our guest is multi-talented.
multi-talented, multidisciplinary?
I've seen obviously you performing in with was it the Culture Embassy? So your band. Oh yeah, obviously you're involved in some academic projects as well. Is it WERO?
WERO.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's Ras Judah. Like, what else would you add to your kind of bio? Like, you probably do it a lot more nice than I could.
Well, yeah, you said it. You know, I play music. I'm playing music for ages, and I still play around with Culture Embassy. Then we had a gig last night at Jack Hackett's.
Oh wow.
Then we got a few things coming up. We'll be releasing some new music, and yeah, I'm part of the WERO Project, doing a research, a PhD research under there as part of this large project with WERO, and my PhD is looking at interethnic relationships.
Oh wow.
So it's like ethnic studies. I like to say it's ethnic studies. You know?
That sounds amazing.
Yeah.
I'm kind of like, I guess let's kind of start off, like, I'd be interested to hear about the Culture Embassy and how that's kind of all formed, and then go for some music, and then we'll come back to like the research and WERO. That sounds like a good kind of structure.
Yeah.
So,
Sounds good.
I guess like, so obviously I know like I moved up to Wellington last year, and I remember pretty early on seeing adverts for like Ras Judah and the Culture Embassy. So how long has that kind of been? How long have you been involved in that sort of thing?
With Culture Embassy, it's 9 years. We'll be celebrating 10 years in
Oh, wow.
March next year, and we are planning a big concert for that in Wellington. So hopefully we get some money to do that.
Watch the space.
Watch the space. Yeah. But it's coming 10 years soon. I came to Wellington in 2013 and then started the Culture Embassy project back then.
Yep.
Yeah.
So what were you kind of looking to? Obviously, like the music is part of it, but like you still talk of it as like a project. Like, what was the kind of the goals you were kind of wanting to kind of achieve?
Yeah. Well, I've been doing music for a long time. Like when I come to New Zealand, I've been doing music for nearly 2 decades. And when I first arrived, I was in Nelson, and there I started in another band. I came there, I was looking for musicians to work with, and then a group of musicians came up, and then we ended up starting a band called One Vibe, and that was like reggae music. We played that. I played with One Vibe until I moved to Wellington, from 2004 right until we even celebrated 10th anniversary with One Vibe, because I'm still in touch with them. In 2014. So now I moved to Wellington. One Vibe was a 5-piece band, and then I moved to Wellington, and I was always I always like diversity, cultural diversity and connecting with people from other ethnic backgrounds. And when I come to Wellington, I was like overjoyed by the diversity, just looking at Africans are here, everyone else, Asians are here.
Coming from Nelson, right?
Coming from Nelson, yeah. Because in Nelson, it was always like, I'm also with the black man on the street. I was looking where's the other black people? I was always the only black man. Even social occasions, I was often the only black man, and then it was refreshing when I got here.
Yeah.
And the Culture Embassy was. I wanted to have a sound, to create a sound that's broad, not just African music or just reggae music. I wanted to create a sound that is, and that's what Culture Embassy is doing at the moment. We do African music, and then we mix it with Latin rhythms in there, and then we got people from Greek musical background, Japanese, and different African cultures like West Africa, East Africa. We bring all that together, so it makes our sound unique. So the whole thing about Culture Embassy was like intercultural communication through music.
Right. And your background's Botswana, right?
Yeah, I come from Botswana.
So, like, does Botswana music have a huge influence in what you're doing as well?
Yeah, absolutely.
Or is it Swana? Swana music?
Setswana.
Setswana.
Yeah, Setswana, yeah. But usually people say Tswana. Yeah, I mean, this is people who speak English. They say Tswana.
Yeah.
But in a proper way of saying it is Setswana.
Setswana.
Yeah, so Setswana is the way of doing things. It can be, and the language is also called Setswana.
Right.
And the people are Botswana.
Right.
The country is Botswana.
Ah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's like that. Yeah. So it's got a lot of influence on my music and Jamaican music too.
Yeah.
Yeah. So reggae, Jamaican reggae, and my cultural music from home.
Okay, so like, how does I know that in Zimbabwe, Jamaican music has a huge influence on the musical flavor in Zimbabwe. Is that the same sort of situation? And South Africa?
Yeah.
With Lucky Dube and is Jamaican, reggae music has a huge influence where you came from as well?
I would say across Africa.
Right.
When Jamaican music started reaching out the world in the 70s and 80s, it resonated with a lot of African people. Like for me personally, I was college boy in the early 80s when I first heard Jamaican music properly, and then I could absorb the message what they were talking about. It was exactly what we're going through. And I think that is the same thing with most African societies, with Jamaican music. So reggae is still, it's still very important music back home.
When we had Simon and Alicia from Three Little Birds, they said the same thing about the influence reggae has had in New Zealand music for the same reasons as well, for the struggle. Is it about the struggle?
Yeah. Socio-economic, politics, colonization, and all those things, those experiences were the same things that the Jamaicans were talking about, was the same things that we had experienced in Africa, So colonization, even the impact of slavery, because those people were taken from Africa, was all like, these guys are speaking the stuff that's really true, and it happened to all of us.
And I guess that's one of those things that it's kind of we always think of it, especially with this transatlantic slave trade, as almost the movement of people to the Caribbean or the Americas and that sort of thing. But also we don't necessarily consider the ways in which that impacted Africa in terms of a population. Like, it's one of those things you see, like, I think that's always like a kind of another side to that we don't necessarily think about as much.
Yeah. I mean, beyond that also is like the image of African in the slave industry. It impacted not only those people outside Africa, it also impacted Africans, because the reflection was like, these are us, it's like we all feel like we're slaves. How we see our people in slavery like that.
And I think it's interesting, like, I do find it interesting, like, seeing the ways in which, I guess, like, that sort of thing is, like, with that kind of arrival of kind of reggae and that kind of how did you see the kind of molding of, like, so obviously there's reggae coming from Jamaica, and you said it's speaking those same stories, but what changes did you kind of see that showed reggae shifting to become specific, so in Botswana, like, to fit that context, like, what ways did kind of reggae and kind of like you said, sounds that you were from familiarity. How did they kind of combine? Like how?
I grew up when Botswana had just come out of being a British protectorate, which is another way of being a colony, and those things were what the Jamaicans were singing, and there are some people like Peter Tosh, they're singing about that stuff. I was at the same time studying history at college. I was always a student who likes to read critically. I was also studying history, and these connections came straight away. And I felt it was personal for me. It became a personal change because it was the reality. It was happening in schools. And if you think of it also, the 1980s in Africa, there was corporal punishment in schools, and we had peace corps, like teachers from America and England, And in particular, there was some experiences I've had, personal experiences of hearing, and this couple who were from the UK, they were teaching in the same school where I was, and they were talking about how African kids need to be whipped in order to listen, you know, and they said, they were saying, and I asked her also, and I said, who told you that? And they said, your African teachers told us that, you know.
Right.
And it's the same message that was coming through the African, the Jamaican music, and I started reading things, Marcus Garvey, Malcolm X, and all those people that make connections. Yeah, and that's how particularly reggae music became part of my education.
It's interesting that you mentioned Malcolm X, because Malcolm X seems to be like the book that anybody who's spent a long time in New Zealand of African heritage has to read at some point. Like it's like 17 or 18 and you've read that book. Like I first read Malcolm X at 21, and it was the first time I'd seen on paper the way that I felt and what I was thinking, but couldn't express it. Yeah. And just that, you know, having that kind of literature around to actually expand your thinking about the situation, like, you know, even reggae music and lyrics. And they're talking about the struggle, and they're talking about colonization and decolonization and all those things. I think it didn't even really appear in New Zealand until like the late 70s, early 80s. Yeah, because Bob Marley came here in 78 or 79, and I was about 13, and it was the first time I'd seen anything like it. You know what I mean? And the music, what he was singing about then, I think that was the one that was filmed in the community centre. Yeah, that particular track was really popular. But next minute, like reggae is everywhere. And it's very it's taken on by the Māori struggle. It's like the theme track of the Māori indigenous struggle in New Zealand.
Reggae speaks about marginalization, marginality, people on the margins, and it speaks of the social inequalities. Like in Botswana, with our experiences, there was stuff happening in South Africa. There was apartheid, full-on segregation of people. And when 1976, I think I was 6 years old, and there was a big massacre of kids, school kids up in Soweto. You know, and these things impacted us also, you know, as youngsters. You can see people your age being shot down by machine guns, you know. You know, it is the images that...
And this was them moving people out of that area into other areas to live, was it? What was it?
I don't know for sure, but that's quite a common thing that occurred. Displacing people, and people refused to go, and then the answer was always violence by the police.
Right.
There was townships, you know, black people lived in townships, like around Johannesburg. Remember, Johannesburg is only 5 hours away from where I grew up, across the border. And there was townships, black people in townships, and then they go out to work and they have to carry a permit if they work. For example, they are a housemaid in the city for a white family. They have to carry a permit to be around town. You can't just go and walk in town as a black person without a permit, otherwise you get arrested. And then there was stuff like, I think this particular episode was the kids didn't want to be taught in Africa. That was the thing.
And they've had a second one about that with one of the universities in South Africa, isn't it? That they didn't want to be taught in Afrikaans or... More recently.
Well, there was a whole issue of, it was like a decolonization project at the time. There were a lot of protests around the university. Like, Rhodes must fall, because you know, Rhodes was a pretty horrible figure in southern Africa, but he's still quite revered, especially in the university. So the whole issue was, there's a decolonization movement essentially. But I think language always comes up in that also because of the history as well. You know, like us as coloureds, we speak English and Afrikaans. And there's a very specific reason why we speak, why we speak English and Afrikaans, because, you know, that's who they are. We teach you this. But it was more so we could work. That was kind of the idea. So a lot of coloureds, because we weren't black, we worked in the homes of white people.
Yeah.
and in the gardens and things. So to communicate was, oh, you speak Afrikaans, but you speak a very specific kind of Afrikaans, you know. So the legacy kind of continues all the way through there. So
Yeah.
I don't know the details, but yeah, it's a decolonization project in itself, or protest, which language has a lot to do with it as well.
How successful has it been?
I don't know for sure because I remember because South Africa has a really interesting way to protest, and it's kind of burn everything,
Right.
you know, which to some extent I'm like, oh yeah, I fully agree. But I was talking to a friend of mine who was at the university, I think, and he said he was upset with it because his car got broken into and then turned upside down and burnt. And I was like, you know what, fair enough, like, that's a pretty good reason to be upset.
Yeah.
But I think the dialogue got a bit lost in the sense of, you know, there's this message, and then everyone was like, but look at all the violence, and kind of what happened with the Black Lives Matter in the States, right? I was like, oh, look at the violence, therefore their message is irrelevant, or null and void. You know, that's kind of what happened a bit in South Africa. I don't know.
It's
for
almost
sure.
the idea that, you know, there's a way to protest. Like,
Yeah.
that if you're not protesting in a certain way, what you say isn't
Yeah.
valid.
Yeah.
I know. I see this one. I'm angry, man. I mean, I understand. You know, if my car's getting burnt up, I'm gonna be pretty upset too. But it's, you know, there is a message there that we shouldn't be policing people along these lines of like. But that doesn't make the message illegitimate. If I'm pretty angry, man.
Well,
Yeah.
1980 was when Zimbabwe got independence, right?
Yes.
And they didn't get independence without having a revolution.
Yeah.
Right, and isn't that the way of most African countries, that in order to get independence, it's not necessarily a peaceful process?
Yeah.
Well, can't be really.
A lot
But
of African countries had to fight for their independence, except for a few. Like Botswana was like the back country. It was very poor. 1966, when the British pulled out,
Yeah.
was very poor. There was really not much in terms of resources until after the British left. 10 years later, there was diamonds discovered, and in the desert, and there was like this huge deposit of diamonds.
Yeah.
After they left.
And if you're a colonizer, why would you want to give up? I mean, why would you want to freely give up your access to all these stolen resources, right? So, like, how can you get out of colonization without it becoming a kind of a battle of some sorts, whatever it is?
Yeah.
And I think that's a good time to go to a music break,
music?
because I think we're leaning right into the WERO Project and questions I'd like to ask you guys about that.
Okay, so first up we have Shana from Kinroti and Kenny-Soul. Kinroti is like essentially one of the Blackhouse's patrons. He's thrown his love from behind the show for since the beginning, and I think you're trying to get him for an on.
I will. I haven't said anything to him yet, but yes,
Yeah.
I'd like to get you on the online, Keen.
So we have Shana, and then I've been listening to a lot of like new grime recently, and I found an artist called Manga Saint Hilaire, and he's fantastic. He's one of those people you hear and you're like, you're mind blowing.
Right.
So I have Fool's Gold from Manga
Cool.
Saint Hilaire, and then Let's Go Girl from Makuka. 'Cause I
Okay,
feel like,
sweet.
So we'll jump into
And
welcome back to the Blackhouse on 106.1 FM. That was Girl from Makuka, and we are back in studio with Ras Judah. So we mentioned at kind of the beginning of the show that both you and Byron are involved in this program. Was it working to end racial oppression?
Yeah.
So WERO. Can you guys give us a bit of like a rundown on what that is, and like just a bit of just give like an overview so then we can kind of dig right into the meat of it all.
Go ahead.
Am I going ahead?
Yeah, Byron.
You
Right.
go ahead.
I mean, it's been funny because I've been with the project for the last 7-8 months or so, and in that whole time when people ask me what it is, I'm like, wow, that's like an MB funded thing, and I kind of go through this whole process not really explaining it well at all.
Right.
But essentially, WERO stands for Working to End Racial Oppression. It's an MB funded research group that looks at and works to understand forms of racism through multiple sectors of society, and then aims to formulate, like, through the research, ways to reduce racism or to combat it in various kind of ways. So my PhD sits within one of the projects, and Ras Judah is another one of those. But we sit within different streams as well. So we've got, I think, what's it, 4 or 5?
Yeah, I think 4 main
Yeah.
streams.
Streams that which then look at different areas that racism can manifest itself through society. For example, mine's looking at, it's actually called Geographies of Racism, but it's essentially looking at the way that racism functions in housing. And then Judah, you have a different one. So I mean, I hope that explains a little bit. That's how I understand it anyway.
Yeah, no, exactly. I think you explained it well. I think the 4 streams are institutional, and then we got employment, and then we got housing, and then we got interrelational, inter-ethnic relations. Ethnic relations. So mine falls under inter-ethnic relations. And my specific project is looking at the dynamics, interrelational dynamics within the ethnic minorities, migrant groups. And I am working within the MILA, Middle East and Latin American and African groups.
Right.
Yeah.
That'll be interesting.
So my research is looking at inter-ethnic relations there, with looking at the phenomenon of racism.
Right. Is it called?
I think of it as prejudice.
Prejudice,
Because really, I don't know if it's racism yet, but the aim of my research is to identify whether we have racism or prejudice, or forms of prejudice that can equate to racism.
Yeah, that would be a really interesting one. So essentially what you're saying is this project is looking at forms of white supremacy that function within the society that we live in. So how can you look at racism without examining white supremacy?
That's a difficult question, but I can give you an example of what my project is looking like so far, because I'm still at the starting point. I'm not really deep into it. I'm just figuring out how I can formulate this whole question of racism. But I think we can't, like you say, we can't look like with my project inter-ethnic. I can't do inter-ethnic relational dynamics without looking at how the dominant group within the inter-ethnic relations influences everyone else's relationships. So that I have to look at how white supremacy, institutional inequality that comes from colonialism. I can't look at my communities without looking at that, because they exist under that big umbrella. And
you're looking at housing?
Yep.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about.
So my research aims to understand the ways racism functions within housing, but specifically at the rental sector.
Right.
So it's looking at it's using the experiences of Africans within the rental sector to understand the way that racism then functions within housing broadly. But I mean, there's kind of 2 components to it in a sense. So the first one obviously is using those experiences to say, hey, look, there's racism occurring here, this is how it occurs, these are the effects, these are the cost of racism, etc., etc. But then also looking at the housing system broadly. You know, understanding the way the housing system functions within New Zealand specifically, but then broader within like a neoliberal Western kind of society, you know, because obviously there are different models of home ownership and housing. But if you look at like a lot of settler colonial areas, New Zealand, Australia, USA, Canada, you know, a lot of the housing's quite specific in terms of that neoliberal shift through the 1990s, where it's become more difficult to access a home in terms of home ownership. Quality is an issue in New Zealand, which isn't quite as big around the world. But then understanding how home ownership has become central to the way that people can live a dignified life. You know, you're able to retire through property. You're able to then get a second property to then put toward your retirement and those things. There's all these factors that come up, and with those ideas, who does that usually benefit? Who does that target? Who are the people left out? And if you look at in New Zealand, for example, Africans rent at a very high rate. I think it's 66% or so who don't own their home, which then often means, well, who isn't retiring? Who isn't gaining intergenerational wealth because of it? That's all those kind of questions, you know? Yeah, exactly. You know, so the way the housing system functions is very specific, but then it has a lot of racial implications to that, because
Yeah.
who's the ones owning homes? Who are the ones who then gain wealth due to that? Who are the ones who miss out? So there's an almost inherent racial component to it, which then dates back through colonial history as well.
Yeah, I remember back in the 80s, you couldn't even enter the rental market really unless you knew somebody, or if you could pay the real estate agent to have a look at the houses.
Yeah.
You actually had to get access. So if you didn't have the money to pay the real estate agent to view the housing, good luck.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, so we're looking at the way that racism functions interpersonally, like the actual, oh, I'm looking to rent a house. Oh, you turned up, sorry, the house is already rented. You know, those things itself, but then also those barriers which almost seem to impact ethnic minorities disproportionately.
Yeah, like I've seen ads,
group, you know.
I've seen on the comments on some rental things, I can't remember where it was, but there was a landlord asking, oh, have you rented to Somali people before, and what's that like?
Yeah.
Well,
It's like renting to people.
Yeah.
I remember my partner saw, and that was, you know, I've got a group of people, and they want to move in, and they look like they're going to cook some very strong smelling food.
Oh,
How do I? And you know, I'm not racist. Like I'm not trying to be discriminatory.
no.
But how do I make it so they can't rent in my like that I can?
Yeah. How do I protect my investment property?
Yeah.
You know, yeah.
From strong smelling food.
Yeah, no, I've heard that one before. Just people making comments about, you know, people cooking stuff that's gonna smell, or cooking curries that's gonna stain the walls.
Yeah.
You know?
And also
Yeah.
the common experience I've found with guys, African guys that are married to white partners, or African women that are married to white partners, and then they separate, and then the housing experience becomes really, really different. And they're struggling a bit more to get into housing because they don't have that white partner there beside them anymore. And it was really funny because for me that other experience has always been my experience, and I'm sort of like, and this is why, you know, I don't go into private rentals, but and then you see this happening and they're kind of bewildered, and I'm like, well, didn't you know what was going on when you got into housing in the first place? Which is, I just, it's crazy.
Yeah.
So I actually wanted to, pivoting on to what you mentioned before about your work involved with like having that kind of focus on like Middle Eastern, Latin American, African kind of groups. Was that a kind of focus on international relationships within those communities and how those communities interact, or is it looking at how those kind of groups, that kind of grouping exists alongside kind of like wider, I guess, the kind of bicultural aspects of New Zealand in the same way?
Yes, both. So there's three aspects. So I'm looking at the general relationships on everyday level of interaction within these groups. So of course they are all big categories of ethnic grouping. So I'll be working with specific communities, key communities, to compare and understand how they relate to one another. What are the challenges? What are the positives? And then the second level will be intra. Specifically I'm interested in the African group and the phenomenon of anti-blackness racism, because I know it exists. We've read about it all over, even overseas.
Yeah.
And it's even got a name called Afrophobia.
Right.
So I'll be within the African group. I've got a section that's going to be specifically focusing on that. How the Africans themselves, because there's different types of Africans, you know, we've got white Africans, Arabic Africans, black Africans, even Asian Africans. So I'll be working with key groups also to look at what is happening with the relationships, because there's histories there, known histories of inequalities and segregation and racism, and to look within the New Zealand context, to see how are those relationships panning out, you know, as our communities grow. And then the third level will be to look at the influence of being here, you know, the influence of the space we are integrating in, you know, how the institutional setup of New Zealand is impacting on these relationships. You know, who is being marginalized more than the other, and what's positive about all this integration of meeting here outside of our historical relationships. Yeah.
And because it's a topic that hasn't had a lot of focus on before in New Zealand, not to the extent that this WERO group is doing, I was reading through some of the explanations and stuff, and the fact that the project acknowledges segregation in this country, I think that's quite a big step. Like, I think it's quite a big and important step, because I think that segregation, what do you think? Because I think that segregation has always been a part of New Zealand's, then the New Zealand project.
Yeah.
The New Zealand colonial project. It's always been a part of that. What's your views on that?
Well, I think most colonial systems were like that, and New Zealand is not an exception. When the institutions were first set up, they were first set up in favor of the colonial settlers, and which is why Maori people end up living on the margins. Maori communities and other people of color who came in as migrants were ended up in the margins, because the institutional setup was colonial in its shape and form, and it was set here for colonial settlers. So segregation is part of it, and we've seen it even in sports. Like, it used to be the norm when South Africa had apartheid. When All Blacks went to South Africa, they wouldn't bring Maori players.
Yeah.
It was all white players. That's segregation.
Yeah.
And I think probably even in the housing,
Housing.
could, I think, looking at the history, I wouldn't be surprised to see that the housing was also segregated from my lifetime.
Yeah.
I mean, housing is an easy way to segregate people, first of all, but it's also, housing is a good representation or an expression of economics. You know, it's a really good expression of economics. Who can afford to live where? Why? What does that mean? What symbols come along with living in the neighborhood? You know,
And
like,
the NIMBYs.
was that?
The
Not in
NIMBYs.
my backyard.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, so there's a lot that goes on, and sort of entitlements to, well, this is my culture, people can't come into my area, you know, so it's I think housing's a really good expression of segregation. Coming back to the idea of segregation being mentioned in the WERO project, I mean, obviously I might be a little bit biased because I'm part of it, but I think this project's quite groundbreaking in many ways.
Yeah.
I think the fact that we as two African researchers are part of a project in New Zealand is a really big deal.
Yeah.
You know,
I
it's
think
a
so
really
as
big
well.
deal.
Absolutely.
You know, both working toward PhDs in a research project that's looking at, you know, obviously they had ideas of what they wanted us to research. You know, they were like, oh, they advertise it being, there's a housing project, come along, you know, there's the topic. But we were able to come along and say, hey, actually, I want to do it this way, or I want to focus on this group. And one thing I got told early on was that they wanted, you know, obviously there's always that risk of being quite token within that space, but it's we want people to be researching or working within their own communities, because we think it's been too long that research has been, you know, the powerful looking down, and then, you know, deficit language comes out of that.
Yeah.
So I think this project itself is quite, it's a huge step forward, because we can come into the space and decide to quite a big extent of what we're doing, why it's important, and where this research can go. You know, my research itself, yes, I get a PhD, well, fingers crossed I get a PhD out of it, but at the end of the day, the research is to help the African community. It's to help a community that I'm part of, that I can't just walk away from when the PhD's done. And that, I think, is a really, really good thing. So, just wanted to say that.
And I guess that's building onto that. That's that idea of, like, in a sense, like, it's a way for you to ground your experiences or your ways of thinking, or like that sort of thing, in those in those spaces, right? So it's that point in time where, like, you know, it's a model to people saying, well, actually, you can take African viewpoints or take those kind of, bring those African objectives to research here.
Yeah. There's a place for it, and if we are one of the first few to do it, that opens the door for so many people to go, actually, that's been done before. We can work. We can look at their work and go on from there. Because I've looked at other Africans' work here, or research on Africans, and that's been hugely influential for how I approach my methodologies, you know, those things. And I think with us doing this, I think it's a really good and interesting way for people to go, actually, that's been done before. We can find a space for this in New Zealand society.
Absolutely, and the other good thing about, you know, the other groundbreaking thing about the WERO project is they allow for indigenous methods. So if I choose to use indigenous methods, for example, I can choose to use African storytelling as a method.
Okay.
If I justify that this is a method that can be executed and can bring out data, I can use it.
Yeah.
So it's explicitly encouraged because it's a decolonization project.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's the other groundbreaking thing that because institutionalists always like stick to the book of the traditional Western way of academia. This is like, and it allows us to work with our communities, which is, for me, I'm a big fan of partnering with communities and making research not just my own, also the community to own the research. Like the communities I researched, I did my master's research with, they are my communities. Now we still hang out, you know. We still hang out on an ongoing basis, you know, they are my family.
Yeah.
And we share information about the stuff we talked about through the research because it's our work.
Yeah.
And I see it not just my work, it's also my work, which I think the WERO project is giving us that, you know, leeway as well, that we can work with our communities and partnership with them.
So I guess what's a kind of good way in terms of like for you know, people my age and younger who are kind of looking into the academic space and that research, like, what would you be your kind of recommendations for how to kind of ground research and ground their work in their communities and in those spaces? Because I think that's something that, you know, when I finished my undergrad, like I feel like I did a lot of things around Africanness and blackness, but it was always from the lens of like, okay, like you said, through that kind of very traditional, it's based on, it's quite separated from the reality, from those people, from those groups. What would be your kind of what would be I guess things for people to be thinking about for how you can ground your work within those community spaces? And yeah, obviously not.
It's a tough one, but I think especially for people like you, Eddie, you already working with the community, and if you're gonna do postgraduate study, perhaps it will be good for you to look at what's needed in your community. What things can you look at that can contribute positively to your community, or what needs to be addressed in the community? That could be your postgraduate project. Like when I did my masters, I mean, I'm an old guy. I already knew some of the problems intuitively. You know, my masters, I looked at integration of African migrants. You know, the experiences of African migrants adapting to New Zealand or being integrated into the institutions and into the societal structures of New Zealand. And I was influenced by my experiences of integration, of settling and then integrating into a society. And I was interested to understand how it impacts on others, because I knew there were some negative impacts as well, and some really kind of like marginalizing aspects of it. So I wanted to understand that and bring it to light so I can share it with the others and then hopefully improve the situation going forward. So maybe in short is to look at postgraduate within communities, to look at what's important for the community at the time you are deciding to study.
Wow, okay. That's a bit of advice, and I think like that's like I know it's something it's good. I guess that's what I'm looking at as I'm doing my postgrad next year, and I think that's what I'm trying to navigate, is that how to kind of reconcile. Okay, here's the thing I really want to do, but how do I? Where do I place it, and how? And I guess what's that kind of not value add, but like how does that kind of link to the spaces that I'm in, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think academia is becoming less abstract now. You know, like people are studying more practical things and more real things. Like in the past, it was like you study to get a certificate. Sometimes you can go and study some really complicated things that no one can even understand. And you get a certificate, and maybe you get in the World Book of Records of studying something really difficult, you know. But this time academia, I think especially the social sciences, if you are leaning towards social science like myself, I look at the social problems within my environment, and that tends out to be my community.
Talking about social sciences, we've got 3 anthropologists in the room and 2 sociologists in the room, and I was more into the academic language probably when I was at university and haven't had much use for it outside of it, except, that might be the way I might study things or research things. Do you think, I've got a question, do you think that everyday people, not in the academic scene, actually understand what the system of white supremacy is and actually understand the meaning of racism? Because I often see in the media they flip out racism with discrimination, and like racism is a system, white supremacy, the system of white supremacy is a system, discrimination is a behavior, right? How are you going to get it across that understanding of this phenomenon to people who are not in the academic scene and talk about it comfortably? Because I think people, if they understand the system, they'd understand the difference, but I think media often confuses it.
I mean, I'll start with an example that isn't, because racism is very difficult, because it's emotionally charged, it's extremely emotionally charged. No one wants to be called a racist. Oh my gosh, I'm not racist, it's a horrible thing, because we think of it as being, I got a hood on my head, But for example,
my son calls me a racist every day. I don't like one of his podcasts.
And I mean that in that sense too, like it's lost a bit of its power because it's just this. It's almost like when Donald Trump was being called a fascist. It's like, well, okay, yes, he's fascistic, but you're now kind of diminishing what really occurred through that time.
What fascism?
But so I was talking to a friend of mine so recently I got a job at Brands as a research assistant that's looking at housing and construction, and we were talking about housing and the system and neoliberal politics and economics, and we were kind of talking about these things, and I'd mentioned a few things, and I mentioned the words David Graeber, who's an author. I mentioned Marx, I mentioned neoliberalism, and he said, cool, that's great, now take all those terms out and say exactly the same thing, and that's how you write your report. It's that idea of you put the language in there, but you take the buzzwords out, because the buzzwords have meaning beyond academia. For example, critical race theory. That's just a way to understand how essential race is to American life. That's where it came from. But now it's taken this whole new world where it's like, oh my gosh, it means we're anti-white now, and all the there's this. It's been taken by the media.
It's the political spin of it, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I guess the point I'm making is you communicate the same thing, but you take the contentious and or emotionally charged words out of it, and then because I do think that there are a lot of people who, coming back to racism, I do think there are a lot of people who don't understand it, but are willing to, as long as you frame it in a way that doesn't say you're the problem. You know what I mean? But I think that's beneficial, but I still have an issue with it in the sense of I'm still catering toward a white conscience. Pragmatically, I think that has its time and place. So the other times where I'm like, look, dude, you're causing part of this problem, man. Like, we gotta sort this out. So I mean, that's my kind of long-winded, confusing, not really answering the question answer. Like, there's a way to do it, and I think it's we as academics have responsibility to make it palatable and understandable. That's what I see part of my role as. A lot of academics might not, but I see as a part of my role.
I'm hoping that the WERO Project takes this head on, like really takes it head on, and that addresses. I'm hoping that they do, because I grew up here, and I'm hoping that they do.
We are all hoping. We are all hopeful, man.
Yeah,
and we have good intentions to do it. Like for me, I really want these things to happen, and I want to be understood. Like Byron was saying about using the language, complicated language. That's not helpful, I think. You know? I think the way I want it to be done to write it. When I write it, I want to write it in a way that people can read and know what is being discussed.
I think that reminds me. There's like a really good video. It's from The Onion, which is like a kind of satire website. But they have there's a video, and it's a Trump. The idea is it's like the title of the video is a Trump supporter apologizes after changing his views after reading like 2,000 pages of critical of Marxist feminist theory.
Right.
And it's one of those points because, and again, the satire point is it's like a dig at kind of one of those things that digs at everything.
Yeah.
But it's saying like it's obviously a critique of like I guess the far right and Trump and the kind of and populism, but it's also a critique of academia. It's of academia and how, in a lot of ways, the ways and the ideas that help unpick a lot of those issues are so bound in these kind of chains of needing to cater to not just the right wing, but also like to a specific kind of academic standard or academic phrase.
I mean, I wish I'd learned a lot of the things that I learned at university in intermediate and college. Like, I think critical race theory should be part of the New Zealand curriculum. I'm all for that.
And that's a really good point too, in terms of, us working toward using these terms, but also kind of making them palatable, understandable through accessible language. That can then be transferable all across many different spectrums, and that could be the education system too, right?
Yeah.
Where we have a conversation about this without ever mentioning critical race theory.
Right.
I think there is...
Because people get scared.
Yeah, there is a point where that should be spoken about and should be mentioned. But there are times, if I'm teaching my child about the histories of colonialism in settler societies, we can have that without saying you are part of the problem. I think we can have those conversations.
Yeah. You can wait to have a few beers and say it later.
Exactly. Time and place.
I think simplifying these ideas is the way to go. Saying them in simple terms.
Yeah, simple language.
Yeah, simple language, readable language.
I mean, academic language can go right over the heads of people that haven't been in academia. And I think that what you guys are doing with the WERO Project is something that's going to be beneficial for a lot of people that are in all classes of society at all levels of education. And how much time we got?
42 seconds.
Right, so and we wish you the best with that project, and hopefully you'll come back and talk to us more about how it's going. And
are there any important dates to know?
Yeah,
in
when you're
terms of
performing.
the Culture Embassy or any?
Yes, the 26th of this month, Havana.
26th of August?
Yeah, 26th August.
What time do you normally start?
Havana, I think it's 9:30.
Okay.
And then the 16th September, Havana again. And then 30th of September, we're doing Botswana Day at the Rogue.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
Right, we'll make sure we promote those and we'll send those dates out.
Yeah, send us some posters if you've got them.
This is Blackhouse 106.1 FM. Peace.
We're out.